The first sign that something was wrong did not come with noise, but with absence, because when the prisoners stepped out of their barracks that morning, expecting the usual rhythm of shouted orders and guarded movement, they instead found the yard suspended in a silence that felt incomplete, as if the day had started without permission. The watchtower stood empty. The gate remained closed but unwatched. Even the guard shack door moved slowly in the wind, opening and closing just enough to draw attention without offering answers. Men slowed their steps, some still adjusting their uniforms, others carrying their tin cups, all of them looking toward the same places where authority should have been waiting. No one spoke at first, not because they understood what was happening, but because no one wanted to be the first to test it. A prisoner near the front took 2 extra steps forward, then stopped, as if expecting a voice to call him back. None came. Another turned his head toward the road beyond the fence, staring longer than he should have. Somewhere behind them, a man let out a short laugh, then immediately went silent. The routine had not changed. It had vanished. And in its place remained something far more dangerous than orders. A moment where no one knew what would happen next, and every man understood that the first move could change everything. The prisoners spread slowly across the yard, their eyes fixed on the empty tower, the silent gate, and the road beyond the fence. And for the first time since their capture, no one was there to stop them. The yard did not move the way it should have that morning, and that alone was enough to make the first group of prisoners stop just beyond the barracks door instead of continuing toward the usual assembly point, because the silence carried something wrong inside it, something unfinished, as if the routine had been cut in the middle of a sentence. Carl Brenner stepped forward with his tin cup still in his hand, then slowed when he noticed that the watchtower ladder stood empty from top to bottom, the platform above it clear, and the small canvas shade fluttering without anyone beneath it. He shifted his weight, glanced toward the fence, then toward the guard shack, expecting at any second to hear a voice correcting them, but nothing came. 2 men crossed the yard ahead of him, walking faster than they should have, then stopping abruptly when they reached the center, as if an invisible line had been drawn there. One of them turned halfway back, raised his hand as though to signal the others to wait, then lowered it again when no one behind him moved. Brenner took 3 more steps and set his cup down on a crate near the wash barrels, freeing his hands as he approached the guard shack door, which stood slightly open, rocking with the wind in small, uneven movements. Behind him, Otto Fischer followed close enough to touch his shoulder, but not close enough to be seen as leading anything. Brenner reached the door and pushed it wider with the back of his fingers, keeping his body angled away as if expecting something inside to react. The hinges creaked, the door swung, and the room revealed itself slowly, first the empty desk, then the chair pushed back at an angle, then a mug resting beside an open ledger with a pencil laid across the page. Otto stepped in first, leaned over the desk and touched the mug, then jerked his hand away immediately, turning toward Brenner with a look that did not need words. Brenner stepped closer, placed his own hand against the side of the cup, and held it there longer, feeling the heat still trapped in the metal. Around them the yard began to fill. More prisoners left the barracks, drawn by the movement, by the open door, by the absence that was now too obvious to ignore. A man climbed halfway up the tower ladder and looked around before coming down again quickly. Another moved toward the gate, stopped short of touching it, and circled back as if afraid that contact alone might trigger something. Someone laughed once, short and sharp, then went quiet when no one joined him. Brenner lifted the ledger from the desk, flipped a page, then another, stopping where the last line of writing broke off in the middle of a number. He carried the ledger and the mug outside into the yard and set them on the crate where his cup had been, letting everyone see both objects clearly. Men crowded closer without speaking, forming a loose ring around the crate, each of them staring at the same two details, the unfinished line and the warmth still held in the cup. Otto pointed toward the gate, then toward the tower, then back at the shack, his gestures quick and uncertain. Brenner followed the motion, looked once more at the empty ladder, then turned his head slowly toward the gate again, where the latch hung in place, untouched, waiting. The first movement toward the gate did not come all at once, but in small, hesitant steps that slowly gathered weight as more prisoners shifted closer to the fence, drawn not by courage but by the simple need to confirm what their eyes were already telling them. Carl Brenner moved first, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a steady pace that forced the others behind him to follow, their boots scraping against the gravel in uneven rhythm. Otto Fischer stayed at his side, glancing between the tower and the gate as if expecting both to come alive at the same moment. Ahead of them, the metal latch hung untouched, the chain resting loosely against the wood, not secured the way it always had been. Brenner stopped one step away, raised his hand slightly, then lowered it again without touching the latch, his fingers hovering in the air as if the object itself might react. A prisoner behind him shifted forward and whispered something that pushed the moment further, and before hesitation could rebuild, Brenner reached out, gripped the metal, and lifted it slowly. The latch moved without resistance. The sound it made was small, almost disappointing, but in the silence of the yard it carried far enough to pull every eye toward the gate. No voice answered it. No rifle followed. Otto pushed the wooden panel open just enough to create a narrow gap, then leaned his head forward and looked through, his body still inside the camp as if unwilling to commit fully. He stepped through next, one foot then the other, pausing on the road outside while the rest of the men watched him, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. He turned in place, scanning the road, then looked back at Brenner and gave a short nod that spread through the group like a signal. Two more men followed, then another, each stepping through with the same careful motion, as though the act itself required permission that no longer existed. Inside the yard, movement accelerated. A group broke away toward the cookhouse, pushing through the rear door after finding it unlocked, while another cluster moved toward the supply shed, pulling at the wooden panels until one gave way enough to let them inside. Brenner stepped out onto the road briefly, crouched down to examine the tire tracks pressed into the dirt, then stood again and turned back toward the camp, making a decision that came quickly and without discussion. He stepped back through the gate and pointed toward the cookhouse, then toward the well, then toward the towers, assigning direction through motion rather than words. Otto returned from the road and joined a group entering the cookhouse, where the smell of food still lingered faintly in the air. He moved along the counter, lifted a lid from one of the metal containers, then set it back down and began opening cabinets, pulling out bread, utensils, and anything that could be carried. Another prisoner climbed onto a crate to reach higher shelves, while a third dragged a sack of flour across the floor, leaving a thin trail of dust behind him. Outside, two men reached the well pump and began working the handle, filling the first bucket slowly, then faster as the water began to flow more freely. At the nearest tower, Heinemann grabbed the ladder and climbed without stopping this time, pulling himself onto the platform and gripping the railing as he scanned the area beyond the fence. He turned his head sharply from one direction to the other, then leaned forward, focusing on something in the distance before calling down, his voice low but urgent enough to shift attention again. Brenner moved toward the base of the tower and looked up, listening, then turned and walked back toward the center of the yard where the groups had begun to spread out. The camp no longer stood still. Men moved between buildings, carrying food, water, and tools, crossing paths without waiting for instruction, reacting to what they saw rather than what they were told. The gate remained open, the road beyond it quiet, and for the first time the prisoners were no longer waiting to understand what had happened. They were already acting inside it. The movement inside the camp did not slow as the morning stretched forward, but instead began to divide into different directions, each group of prisoners acting on its own urgency, as if the absence of guards had removed not only control, but also the need to wait. Near the open gate, several men remained gathered, stepping out onto the road and then back again, testing the distance in short, uncertain advances, while inside the yard others carried supplies from the cookhouse and stacked them in the center, creating small piles of bread, water, and utensils that grew larger with every trip. Karl Brenner moved between both areas, his pace steady but increasingly faster, his attention shifting from one task to another as if trying to keep the camp from pulling itself apart. Otto Fischer crossed the gate again, this time moving farther down the road, his steps quicker than before, driven less by hesitation and more by the need to see beyond the immediate horizon. He passed the tire tracks Brenner had examined earlier and continued toward the tree line, stopping only when the ground dipped slightly and the shadows ahead thickened. Behind him, another prisoner followed, then a third, forming a small group that moved just beyond the reach of the fence, each step taking them farther from the structure they had known. Otto crouched, picked up a small piece of debris near the roadside, then stood again, scanning the area as if searching for signs of recent movement. Back inside the camp, Heinemann remained in the tower, gripping the railing as he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the same stretch of road Otto had taken. He shifted his position, squinting into the distance, then suddenly straightened and called down again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the yard and pulling attention upward. Brenner turned immediately, moved to the base of the tower, and began climbing halfway before stopping to listen, his hand tight against the wooden rung. Heinemann pointed toward the far side of the trees, his arm extended, holding the direction steady as if afraid it might disappear. At the same moment, a sound broke across the distance. It was sharp, isolated, and unmistakable. A single gunshot echoed from beyond the trees. Otto froze where he stood. The man behind him dropped instinctively to the ground, his hands pressing into the dirt. The third prisoner turned halfway back toward the camp, his body caught between running and staying. For a fraction of a second, nothing followed the sound. No second shot, no voices, no movement visible from where they stood. But the silence that came after felt heavier than the noise itself. Inside the camp, everything changed at once. Men who had been carrying food stopped mid-step. A bucket slipped from someone's hands near the well, spilling water across the ground. Brenner dropped from the ladder and moved quickly toward the gate, his stride no longer cautious. He reached the opening just as Otto and the others began moving back, not running, but moving fast enough to show that whatever lay beyond the trees was no longer an unknown worth exploring. He grabbed Otto by the arm as he stepped through, pulled him inside, then turned and pushed the gate inward, not closing it fully but narrowing the opening as if instinct demanded some form of barrier. Around them, the yard shifted from scattered movement into something tighter, more controlled. Men who had spread out across the camp now moved back toward the center, their actions no longer driven by curiosity, but by reaction. Heinemann climbed down from the tower, landing hard enough to stumble forward, then turned immediately toward Brenner, speaking quickly, pointing again toward the trees, then toward another direction, as if trying to map what he had seen before the shot. Brenner listened only long enough to understand the urgency, then turned and began giving instructions through motion, directing groups toward the towers, toward the supply stacks, toward the edges of the yard. Near the rear fence, two prisoners discovered a section of wire that had been cut, not cleanly, but hastily, the metal bent outward in uneven angles. One of them touched the broken edge, then stepped back as if the damage itself carried meaning. He called out, and within seconds others gathered, staring at the gap, then looking toward the same tree line where the shot had come from. The camp was no longer testing freedom. It was reacting to something outside it. And for the first time since the guards had vanished, the question was no longer whether they could leave. It was whether they should. The energy inside the camp shifted immediately after the shot, not into panic, but into a tighter, more controlled movement that spread from one group to another without the need for explanation, as if the sound from beyond the trees had forced every man to understand that whatever freedom they had tested minutes earlier could disappear just as quickly. Carl Brenner moved through the yard with a pace that no longer carried hesitation, pointing toward the gate, then toward the supply stacks, then toward the towers, assigning positions through motion that others followed without question. The open space that had invited movement now demanded structure. At the gate, 3 prisoners dragged a wooden bench across the opening and positioned it at an angle, not closing the entrance completely, but narrowing it enough to slow anyone coming through. Another man carried a second bench and set it behind the first, creating a layered barrier that could be moved quickly if needed. Otto Fischer stepped in to help, gripping one end of the bench and adjusting it until the gap between the boards left just enough room to see the road without exposing the yard fully. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his trousers, then looked toward the tree line again, holding his gaze there longer than before. Near the cookhouse, the scattered supplies began to take form. 2 men lifted a sack of flour and carried it into the central barracks, placing it against the wall beside a growing stack of bread and utensils. Another filled a second bucket at the well and carried it carefully across the yard, setting it down beside the first, aligning it without thinking. Inside the cookhouse, a prisoner stirred a pot left on the stove, then added water from a canteen, adjusting the heat with slow, deliberate movements. The smell of food began to return, faint at first, then stronger, grounding the space in something familiar despite everything else changing around it. At the nearest tower, Heinemann climbed again, this time slower, pausing midway to look outward before continuing to the platform. He gripped the railing and scanned the horizon, turning his head in controlled movements, focusing not only on the road but on the fields beyond it. Below him, two others waited at the base, ready to take his place when needed, their eyes following his line of sight as if they could see what he saw simply by watching him. Brenner crossed the yard once more, moving toward the rear fence where the cut wire had been found. He crouched beside it, pressed his hand against the bent metal, then stood and pulled a strip of cloth from his pocket, tying it to the broken section so it would be visible even in low light. A second prisoner joined him, then a third, and together they pulled loose strands of wire inward, not repairing the fence fully but reducing the opening enough to slow movement from either side. As the sun began to lower, the camp settled into a rhythm that had not been imposed but built. Men moved between positions without needing direction, passing items from one to another, checking the towers, the gate, the supplies, each action linking to the next. Conversations remained low, brief, and purposeful, replaced quickly by movement whenever something needed to be done. When evening approached, a small group gathered near the cookhouse, distributing food from the pot into tin bowls, handing them out one by one without rushing, without pushing, each man taking his portion and stepping aside. Otto took his bowl and moved toward the edge of the yard, sitting on a crate near the gate, his eyes still fixed outward as he ate slowly. Across from him, another prisoner did the same, then another, until a quiet line formed along the inner edge of the camp, each man facing the same direction. The light faded gradually, and with it the visibility beyond the fence. One by one, prisoners moved toward the barracks, some carrying supplies inside, others checking the towers one last time before climbing down. Brenner stood near the guard shack, looking across the yard as it emptied, then stepped inside briefly, returning with the ledger and placing it on a table near the central barracks, keeping it within reach. The camp had not returned to what it was before. It had changed into something else, not controlled by guards, not driven by fear, but held together by the actions of the men inside it, each movement replacing the silence that had started the day, building a structure that no one had planned, yet everyone now followed. The night did not pass in complete silence, but in controlled stillness that held the camp together, until the first pale light of dawn began to spread across the yard, revealing shapes that had not moved much since darkness settled. The benches still braced at the gate, the buckets lined near the well, and the towers occupied by men who had taken turns watching through the long hours without being told to do so. Carl Brenner stood near the guard shack, his posture straighter than it had been the day before, not from authority, but from the simple fact that there was now something to maintain. A low sound reached the camp first, distant and uneven, like an engine struggling before finding rhythm. Heads turned almost at the same moment. Otto Fischer stepped forward from his position near the gate, setting his empty cup down on the crate without looking at it, his attention fixed on the road beyond the fence. In the tower above him, Heinemann leaned forward, gripping the railing tightly as the sound grew clearer, resolving into the distinct approach of vehicles moving over rough ground. The first shape appeared through the early light, a jeep emerging from the tree line, followed by a second vehicle behind it, both moving steadily toward the camp without hesitation. Brenner raised his hand slightly, not to command, but to steady the movement around him as several prisoners shifted closer to the gate, drawn by the approach. No one ran. No one scattered. The structure built during the night held. As the vehicles reached the outer stretch of road, the details became visible: uniforms, helmets, rifles, and the rigid posture of men who had returned with purpose. The jeep slowed, then stopped just short of the gate, the engine idling for a moment before cutting off completely. One of the American officers stepped down, his boots hitting the ground with a firmness that contrasted sharply with the silence of the previous day. He paused, looking at the gate, then at the arrangement of benches set behind it, then beyond them at the prisoners standing inside the yard, not scattered, not disordered, but positioned in a way that showed intention. Another soldier moved forward, placing his hand on the wooden panel, pushing it slightly before stopping when he felt the resistance from the barricade. Brenner stepped forward without waiting, reaching the gate before any instruction came, his hands moving to the bench, pulling it aside with the help of Otto, then shifting the second barrier just enough to allow the gate to open. The wood creaked as it moved, the gap widening slowly until the entrance stood clear again. He stepped back immediately after, creating space, his movement precise and deliberate. The American officer walked through first, his gaze moving across the yard, taking in the stacked supplies, the filled buckets, the occupied towers, and the men standing in positions they had not been assigned by any guard. Behind him, the others followed, spreading out slightly, their presence restoring the structure that had been missing but not erasing what had happened in their absence. Near the cookhouse, one of the prisoners lifted a crate and set it back into place where it had originally been, aligning it with the wall. At the well, another adjusted the buckets, straightening them instinctively. In the tower, Heinemann began climbing down, stepping carefully, returning to the ground as the guard below took his place without being told. Otto picked up his cup from the crate and held it briefly before placing it inside the barracks doorway. Brenner turned once more toward the guard's shack, walked inside, and placed the ledger back on the desk exactly where he had found it, closing it gently before stepping out again. The yard filled with sound once more, voices, movement, orders returning to their place, but something underneath it had shifted permanently. The same space, the same fences, the same routines had come back, yet the memory of what had happened without them remained visible in every corner of the camp. Because for a single day and a single night the prisoners had not waited, they had acted, and nothing about that could be undone. When the noise of the camp returned and the routine settled back into place, nothing appeared different from the outside. The same fences, the same towers, the same orders moving through the yard, yet the men inside carried something that had not been there before, because for one full day they had stood without direction, moved without permission, and built something out of silence that no guard had ordered them to create. The benches at the gate had been placed by their own hands. The water had been drawn and carried without command. The towers had been watched not out of duty but out of necessity. And when the guards stepped back into the camp, they did not return to chaos but to a structure already standing. That was the change, not escape, not rebellion, but the moment when control disappeared and something else took its place. And once seen, it could never be unseen.
Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.